What's your I met a celebrity but didn't let on that I knew who they were story? My dad and I bumped into Michael Jordan at a Walgreens near Chicago. This was back in 2006 or so. We were picking out birthday cards for my mom. And MJ and his son came in the same aisle browsing some cards. My dad kept his cool and continued to look through different cards, giving him his personal space. Capital I, on the other hand, was 9 years old and in awe, sort of staring at him. After MJ picked out his card, he winked at me and gave me a walk by fist bump. Didn't really set in until I was older how cool that was. I worked at a Barnes & Noble in NY as a clerk, but once or twice I'd be called over to the in-store Starbucks cafe to help out whenever they were understaffed. One time, Alan Rickman came up and ordered something. I can't recall what. I wrote hand scrubber on his cup though. He smiled at me when he noticed it. My husband was vacationing in Arizona, killing time in a bar over a burger and a beer. A guy sits next to him and my husband has a nice chat with him. The guy leaves and my husband goes to close his tab and the bartender tells him it's been covered by the guy he was talking to. The bartender asks if he knows who he was talking to. My husband has no idea. Chuck Norris. It was his bar. Edit. How embarrassing. It wasn't Arizona. It is Woody's Wharf in Newport, California and still exists today. The story is still true. I just flaked on the location. Thanks for all the fun comments. I helped Steven Spielberg move his daughter's bags into her college dorm. I was working a shift helping first years move in and I see a guy in a hat and sunglasses who is unmistakably Spielberg. I strike up a conversation. Ask if he needs help with the bags. etc. First names only, we're from CA. My wife, Kate. And I sent all our kids to East Coast schools though. Stuff like that. Later, when his daughter opened the door for the first time, he whipped out a camcorder and, wearing the biggest dad grin, recorded the whole thing before turning the camera on my friend and me to ask us about the city. So, I have a supporting, the luggage, speaking role in a limited release, home movie, film shot by Steven Spielberg. Worked at a hotel and Russell Crowe came in the lobby. He went to the house phones and called front desk, where I was working. I could see him pretty easily. I answered the phone and he asked to be connected to a room so I put him through. This wasn't long after he threw a phone at a hotel clerk so I didn't want to take a chance at pissing him off. I used to be a server at a Mexican restaurant right outside LA in the late 90s. One day Leonardo Dicaprio came in with who I assume was his mom to have lunch. This would have been post-Titanic, so really at the peak of his breakthrough mega celeb status. He was wearing a ball cap, sunglasses and unshaven, but I recognized him anyway. I didn't let anyone know and I wrote something like "Your movies are awesome. I hope you liked our food" on his receipt when I dropped it off at the table. After he left, I swung by and picked up his payment and he had left me a note back that said "Thank you so much for not blowing my cover" with a $100 tip. Sheet was awesome. I was only like 19. I went and got some PlayStation games with it after my shift ended. Samuel L. Jackson was on my flight. I was second to last to board the flight and there was all this commotion with the flight attendants and gate crew. Once I approached the door of the plane I realized they were all looking at Samuel L. Jackson. He was standing by the cockpit making himself available to passengers' fans. I played it cool. Didn't say a word. Turns out, I'm shy around celebrities. I'm just glad I didn't make a snakes on the plane joke. Was at a convenience store in LA when me and a very nicely dressed black gentleman walked up to the cashier at the same time to pay. It was nighttime and he had his dark shades on and was talking on his phone. I gave him the after you gesture and he nodded and said "Thanks buddy," paid and left. It wasn't until he was out of the store that I realized he was Jamie Foxx. About 40 years ago my father was sitting next to Telly Savalas at some Vegas blackjack table. For about an hour they talked and bet some large amounts of money and my father never let on that he knew the guy was famous. Tully finally says, "It's pretty cool that you haven't asked for my autograph." My father responds, "Well, you didn't ask for mine." Tully laughs and writes on a cocktail napkin, "Hey Jeff, can I have your autograph?" He carried that damn napkin with him for years. In the mid-90s I was a cab driver. Our service was like a cross between a limo and a taxi. And we serviced some fancy resorts. As I dropped off my passenger at a resort, another guy asks if I'm a taxi. And I say yes. So he tells his friend their cab is here. His friend got in the car and said, "This ain't no cab. Smells too good to be a cab," in that unmistakable Chris Rock voice. He and his friend just bulleted with each other for the 15-minute drive to local nightclub. There was a white kid trying to talk to the yellow cab driver ahead of us in the parking lot, and Chris Rock started imitating the kid. Like, "I need a ride. Yeah, I'm drunk. But I need a ride." And I was trying really hard not to laugh out loud. He wasn't nearly as famous yet at the time. But I had seen his stand-up routines on Comedy Central and knew exactly who he was. But didn't go fanboy on him. 10/10 would drive Chris Rock again. Conan O'Brien. My college friend's dad owned an Irish restaurant in Manhattan and she waitressed there back in the 1990s. She said he was super rude to the staff and was a bad tipper. One day a bunch of us were walking in the city and we saw him at a sidewalk cafe. We stopped and stared and he noticed we were talking about him. My other friend went up to his table and asked him to take a picture of us and handed him her camera. His friends at the table had a huge laugh at his expense as we posed for a picture without him in it. We never let on we knew who he was. Now we all hold dear enough sent a photo of us with a funny backstory. Before I realized who he was, Sean Alexander asked me if I liked football. I told him I liked the Steelers. He said, "Yeah, I lost to them in the Super Bowl." I felt pretty stupid. But he thought it was funny. Super nice guy. I feel like it's okay to not recognize a football player. How often do you see their faces? Unless they are the QB? My mom is a big sports fan. One time she was shopping at and saw a really large, fit-looking man who she didn't immediately recognize but seemed familiar. She thought it must have been a professional football player or something. So she went up to the only other person in the shop, who was this smaller weird-looking guy, and asked him if he knew who the athletic-looking man was. The short guy looked at my mom and said, "That's my bodyguard. I'm Elton John." Not sure if this counts as a celebrity, but last fall I was flying from LA to Dallas and the person sitting next to me was a Real Housewife from Bravo. I didn't recognize her since I don't watch her show, but she did mention it to me multiple times during the flight. She wanted to apologize in advance in case there were fans hounding her at the baggage claim. Spoiler alert, there weren't. Hours later when I was checking into my hotel, she was there in the lobby and made sure to tell me again that she was on TV. Not sure if this counts, but when I was 15 I was really into playing StarCraft, being a 3-month-old game at the time, on Battle.net. I did mostly 3v3 games. After finishing this one particularly epic match, close game, we won. We all got into a chat room to talk about how fun that was. Ike. One of them says something to the effect of, "Not sure if you all care but you just beat Ben Affleck." Of course we all ask him to prove it. So he told us to wait a minute and visit his official website's message board, benaffleck.com or something like that. He had just made a post in Red being Ben Affleck himself, about just losing a game of StarCraft. We briefly chatted with him and that was it. Robin Williams used to walk around my lone childhood country town near SF. I saw him once, after hearing many rumors about his sightings. Not entirely unlike Bigfoot or Nessie sightings. My brain didn't fully comprehend what it was seeing, but I could tell he was trying his very best to remain incognito and not draw any unwanted attention. We locked eyes. He smiled. I smiled and nodded back. And we both went our separate ways. This happened yesterday. My wife took my son to the zoo, and he wanted to read every little plaque in the reptile area. My wife was distracted for a moment, so he asked the nearest stranger to read the plaque for him. My wife turned around to see Scarlett Johansson happily reading the info to him. I was sitting at the Genius bar at an Apple store one day and a very large man with dreads came and sat next to me. He was bringing his phone in to get fixed because he dropped it and didn't have a case. I overheard an employee jokingly say, "You wear a helmet when you play football. Shouldn't your phone have the same protection?" I knew it was Larry Fitzgerald. But I didn't want to be a fanboy, so I started asking very broad questions about what he did as a profession to stay engaged in a conversation with him. Larry Fitz is, to this day, one of the nicest, most humble people I have ever met. I, almost literally, ran into Shaq at a small restaurant in LA. He was standing in the doorway. You know how some people are so tall you don't see them? So I'm exiting the doorway and say, "Excuse me man," and he stepped aside so I could leave. He is one large human being. My ex-wife met him when she was in high school. Went to some cheerleading competition in Florida. She was like 5'1". He was duck or knows what size. She said he palmed her entire head, which explains why she loved blowing my neighbor. Ducking who or colon. Met Elon Musk in a Tesla store in LA. Really wanted to meet him but didn't want to be that guy. Decided I had a plan. So walked up to him and said, "Excuse me, do you work here?" He replied, "I mean yeah, kind of." I say, "What can you tell me about the entertainment console of the Model S?" He says, "Let me see if I can find someone to help you." To which I say, "Nah, I'm just ducking with you." He laughed and shook my hand and walked off. Stood in front of Miranda Cosgrove in line for Space Mountain at Disneyland. Weirdest part of it was we were in the same car on the ride and nobody screamed or did anything during the ride. It was completely silent. Me and my sister just looked at each other like WTF is going on? Edit. People are asking for the picture at the end. I finally found it. She's in the front row on the right. Imgur.com. My dad met Robin Williams in an elevator. He got in and they rode a few floors in silence. They stopped on a floor and a bunch of fans ran in and started getting pics with Robin. My dad said he was gracious and took pics with everyone. The doors closed and they rode a few more floors and my dad turned and said, "Does that ever get old?" and Robin smiled and said, "Nope. Never." Then my dad got off on his floor and they nodded to one another and my dad went on with his day. I was 10 years old in 2002 when my mom took me to the Bronx Zoo for the first time. It was a rainy day so we practically had the whole place to ourselves except for 3 British kids running around, chaperoned by a woman. My mom quickly befriended the woman while I made like a kid and joined the horde, looking at spiders and scorpions and sharing in the awe and excitement of the animals. After about an hour when we said our goodbyes, my mother told me that the kid, Daniel, who I had been hanging out with, had played Harry Potter in the movie that came out last year. I had thought he looked familiar. When I was younger with fewer responsibilities, I used to just drive around for the hell of it. To me, driving is a hobby. Late at night was my favorite time. The streets are empty. My uncle is like this too. I asked him if he wanted to meet at American Coney Island. We sat down in a booth. A couple guys walked in after us and sat down behind us. Eminem, Dr. Dre, and a guy I later found out was Jimmy Iovine. We paid them no attention, but we knew who they were. They finished before us and as they were walking out, Eminem nodded at us and said, "Thanks for not making a big deal about this. We got you." He and the other guys disappeared around the corner. I met Simon Pegg when I was working as a cashier at Borders. It was like a Tuesday in the afternoon and the place was empty. He came up to me with some stationery and I started ringing him up. The entire time I was thinking he looked so much like him. But I didn't think it was him since I wasn't in the UK and as far as I knew he wasn't filming a movie in Chicago. So it was a pretty quiet transaction. After it was done and I was handing him his bag with his stuff, I jokingly said, "Has anyone told you that you look like the guy from Shaun of the Dead?" He replied, "I am the guy from Shaun of the Dead." I met a celebrity but I didn't realize who he was. I posted before in a thread buried in 10k comments. Doubt anyone saw it. Years ago. Like 20 years ago. I went to see Adam Sandler stand up at a small comedy club. Clearly I knew who he was because I got tickets to his show. My date and I were running a smidge late and ran into a guy in the lobby. A guy I used to work with. So I was like, "Hey, Danny. How are you doing? What have you been up to?" He was like, "I'm good. How are you?" I responded that I was good. But running late for the show. Had to run and he said, "Okay. Have a good night," and walked off. As my date and I walked into the club, he said, "You know who that was?" It wasn't Danny. It was Adam Sandler. But, gotta say, he played the part of Danny well. One of his better roles. Working cashier at a tiny candy store during a lull. And suddenly we're swarmed with black suits and shades. Some guys in suits come in with more shades shadowing them. They browse. Buy chocolates. And hand them to another suit. I joked to one guy about that box definitely not being big enough for everyone. And he laughs and buys 3 more. They pack up and shades escort them out. Couldn't have been more than 10 minutes. When I went home, I found out that Air Force 2 had landed for a conference nearby. And I had managed to convince the Secretary of something, Defense, I believe, to buy $200 of chocolate. I worked at a movie theater in Albuquerque at the time they were filming the first Avengers film. Captain America was about to come out. I remember because we had the huge standee of him in the lobby. I was reading in the box office when 3 people came up. Guy asked for 3 tickets to Bridesmaids. It was dark out and he had a green baseball cap and sunglasses. He paid with a credit card. Christopher Evans. I stared at the card after I swiped it. Handed it back. "I need you to sign the receipt." He did. And then he walked in. Edit. Thanks for all the comments, guys. Just to add on. I didn't recognize the other 2 with him. One was a blonde woman and the other was a guy with buzzed hair and a 6 o'clock shadow. Also, I only lived in ABQ for a year in 2010 to 2011. This doesn't count because it's about my father-in-law. And he legitimately didn't know who she was. But we were vacationing in Maine and spending a lot of time on the beach. My father-in-law would walk his dog early every one morning. He met this lady and they would meet up and walk their dogs together, then go their separate ways. One morning I got up early to come with him. And to my surprise, we met up with Sigourney Weaver and went for a walk. I was at a test screening of the movie Valkyrie. Me and my friends were near the front of the theater talking before the movie started. And I went on this big, loud rant about how normally I like Tom Cruise movies but War of the Worlds was such a piece of shit. One of the worst movies I've ever seen. Plot didn't make sense. They strung a bunch of cool scenes together and put a shit happy ending on it and called it a day. After I wrap up my 5-minute rant outlining everything wrong with War of the Worlds, the person sitting behind us tapped me on the shoulder and pointed 4 seats down in my row to Tom Cruise glaring at me. I gave him the nod and sat there for what might have been the longest 10 minutes before a movie started ever. Not quite what you were asking for, but close enough for an excuse to tell that story. TLDR, didn't notice Tom Cruise was listening while I talked shit about one of his movies. I was at IKEA in Vancouver and noticed this lady in a low-hanging hat had dropped something. I helped her pick it up and noticed it was Sarah McLachlan. Didn't let on that I knew who she was because I couldn't think of anything to say. There is a local celebrity lawyer around here with massively overplayed commercials where he says the catchphrase "I'll make them pay." Everyone knows him and his dumb catchphrase. Once I was working as a cashier and he came through my line, spending like $500 on household bullshit. He clearly expected me to recognize him and kept saying, "Are you gonna make me pay?" I played dumb because I wasn't in the mood and said haha yep. "Unfortunately that'll be $500. He said haha Roman. "That's a lot to make me pay haha yep." "Sorry." Dude ran his card and signed the receipt with a huge, clear signature. He was such a doucher. My cousin rode a ski lift with Jack Black in Vale. Just the two of them. Her husband and I were in the lift behind them. Freaking out. When we got off the lift they'd gone their separate ways. We made our way to her. She was like, wow. That guy on my lift was so nice. We were like, no shit, that was Jack Black. She was like the School of Rock guy ! She was so embarrassed. She said she rambled on about living in Iowa for most of their conversation. We laughed our asses off. My sister had an encounter with Jack Black where she didn't know it was him. We were at a concert for my uncle's band and she texted me from downstairs while she was charging her phone. I totally just had a conversation with someone who looked like a fatter Jack Black. I texted her back that our uncle knows Jack Black and that was definitely him. Good thing she didn't do the whole "do you ever get that you look like a heavier Jack Black" thing. I was in Tokyo, Japan and was visiting the square cutout tower with my grandparents. We were trying to take a family picture when an American businessman offered to take the picture for us. He did. We said thank you. And afterwards, as after he was going down the escalator, one of his Asian entourage told us it was Jeb Bush. My grandparents nearly shit themselves. Chris Evans. He apparently has a reputation for being a genuinely great person, but if people begin to recognize him and ask for autographs he will stop going to wherever it happened. I met Giancarlo Esposito at the Whole Foods in Austin, Texas 4-5 years ago. Gus Fring from Breaking Bad. I worked there as a security guard at the time and he asked me where the cheese section was. I told him and he very politely said thank you and went on his way. A few people walked over to him to ask for photos, but I was happy just to have met him. I met a NASCAR driver. Even had dinner with him. But I don't remember which one. Everyone else was impressed that I met him.